Erwan's videos appear to be about food, but food is only the surface. Underneath the markets, roadside kitchens, tasting tables, and long drives is a question about authority. Who gets to decide what Filipino food means? Which places deserve attention? And which stories become part of the national appetite? That question is built into the structure of FEATR, the platform that grew out of Erwan's earlier YouTube work. The channel does not simply present a recipe and ask whether it tastes good. It moves through provinces, markets, family kitchens, restaurants, farms, bakeries, and home businesses. It treats food as a route into history, work, memory, geography, and identity. A dish is never only a dish. It is a reason to go somewhere and ask who has been keeping a tradition alive. The official uploads make this approach visible. There are food crawls in Laguna, Bulacan, Baguio, Pampanga, Cebu, Leyte, Kalinga, Bicol, and Ilocos. There are stories about Filipino bread, coffee, local markets, regional dishes, and the food of a particular city. Even the titles sound like assignments. Find the best local eats, explore the oldest Chinatown, taste the food of a province, test whether a famous dish deserves its reputation. The video begins with a destination, but the destination quickly becomes a question of value. This is different from a conventional cooking show. A cooking show usually begins with control. The kitchen is prepared, the ingredients are measured, and the result is meant to be repeated. Erwan's travel format begins with uncertainty. The road may be long, the food may be unfamiliar. The best answer may not come from a polished restaurant, but from a person whose work is known mainly by the people who live nearby. The camera has to search before it can judge. That search gives Erwan a particular kind of authority. He is not only tasting, he is selecting. He decides which stall becomes an opening scene, which cook receives a longer conversation, which dish is explained through history, and which reaction becomes the emotional payoff. The audience experiences the Philippines through a chain of editorial decisions. What looks like a spontaneous food adventure is also a carefully constructed map of attention. There's nothing wrong with curation. Every documentary is shaped by choices. The important question is whether the choices are visible. A host who says this is the best food in a province is not making a neutral statement. He is creating a hierarchy. A host who calls a place underrated is changing the audience's expectations before the first bite. A host who describes a dish as authentic is invoking a standard that may not belong to one person or one kitchen. The word authentic is especially complicated in food media. It can protect a tradition from being flattened into a trend, but it can also freeze a living cuisine in place. Filipino food changes when families move, when ingredients become expensive, when restaurants adapt to new customers, and when cooks borrow from one another. A dish does not become less Filipino because it has traveled. It may become a record of the people who carried it. Erwan's strongest videos understand that food is not a museum object. They let cooks explain why a recipe exists, how a market works, what a community values, or why an ingredient matters in a particular place. The camera moves from the plate to the person. A dish may be the thumbnail, but the story is often about labor, waking early, sourcing ingredients, carrying a family business, preserving a method, or convincing customers to try something they have already decided not to understand. This is where the visual language of FEATR becomes important. Wide shots establish the journey. Road signs, coastlines, market streets, and provincial landscapes give the food a location. Close-ups create appetite. The knife, the steam, the sauce, the hands assembling a plate. Then, the interview adds context. The sequence is effective because it connects desire to explanation. We are invited to want the food, but also to ask why this food is here and who made it possible. The journey itself becomes a form of proof. When Erwan drives to a province, walks through a market, or sits with a local cook, the distance suggests effort and therefore value. The food feels more meaningful because the camera has traveled for it. This is a powerful documentary device, but it carries a risk. Distance can make an ordinary local life look exotic to an outside viewer. A community should not have to appear remote before it is considered worth seeing. FEATR often pushes against that risk by giving the people on camera time to speak. The best moments are not always the dramatic reaction shots. They are the explanations, why a family kept making the same product, how a market shaped a neighborhood, what a dish means during a holiday, or how a small business survived changes in taste. These details interrupt the fantasy that Erwan has discovered a place that nobody knew. The place was known. The video is simply giving a wider audience a reason to pay attention. That distinction matters because food media can easily turn culture into content. A recipe can be admired, copied, monetized, and separated from the people who developed it. A local specialty can become a trend while the original makers remain invisible. The more successful the video becomes, the more important the framing becomes. Is the story about a clever host finding something new, or about a community whose knowledge was already valuable before the camera arrived? Erwan's public image sits inside this tension. He is approachable enough to guide the viewer, knowledgeable enough to make distinctions, and visible enough to become part of the product. The audience trusts his taste, but that trust is also the engine of the format. We do not only watch to see what the food looks like, we watch to see what Erwan thinks it means. That is why his work is more interesting than a simple list of recommendations. It shows how a personality becomes a filter for national identity. The Philippines contains countless food traditions, but a digital audience encounters them through a sequence. One host, one camera, one edit, one title, one conclusion. The country becomes legible through taste, and taste becomes a form of storytelling power. The platform's rebrand from Erwan's earlier channel into FEATR makes that power even more visible. The project expanded from one creator's presence into a broader food, encounter, and travel identity. Erwan remains central, but the channel presents itself as a space for more stories than one personal kitchen could hold. That expansion raises a useful question. Can a personality-led channel grow into an institution without losing the people whose lives give it meaning? The answer depends on what the camera does after the first bite. If the video ends with a reaction, the food becomes a product. If it ends with a person, a history, or a question, the food becomes an opening. FEATR is strongest when it refuses to treat discovery as ownership. Erwan can introduce a cook to a wider audience without pretending that the introduction created the value. This also explains why the channel's provincial videos matter. They do not simply move the viewer away from the city. They challenge the idea that the city is where culture becomes official. A small bakery, a market vendor, a family kitchen, or a regional ingredient can carry as much knowledge as a celebrated restaurant. The camera changes the scale of the story. What looked like a side note becomes the main subject. But attention is not the same as justice. A viral video can make a place famous without changing the conditions that made the work difficult. A restaurant can receive new customers and new pressure. A cook can become recognizable while losing control over how their food is described. Visibility can help, but it can also create a new demand to perform an identity for visitors. That is the ethical problem at the center of Erwan's format. The camera wants a clear story, but food rarely has one meaning. It wants a verdict, but taste is shaped by memory. It wants a hidden gem, but the people living there may not want to be treated as a secret waiting to be discovered. A responsible food story does not abandon excitement. It makes excitement answerable to context. The structure also makes the audience part of the story. We are not passive diners. We are being taught how to notice. The edit tells us when to admire a landscape, when to listen to a vendor, when to expect a reveal, and when to accept a host's judgment. Once we see that pattern, the videos become more than recommendations. They become lessons in how media turns taste into belief. This is why the strongest feature episodes feel less like consumption and more like listening. They allow the viewer to move from appetite to curiosity, from curiosity to respect, and from respect to a more difficult question. What would it mean to value this place even if no famous host had visited it? Erwan's real subject, then, is not simply Filipino food. It is the act of making food visible. His videos show how a country can be introduced through its flavors, but they also reveal the power involved in choosing which flavors represent it. The host may guide us to the table, but the table was built long before the camera arrived. The most honest food story is not the one that claims to discover a hidden taste. It is the one that remembers who kept that taste alive when nobody was watching. Erwan's best work points toward that truth. Food can open the door to a culture, but it should never close the door behind the people who made it.